Hello and welcome to Beyond the Noise, the podcast series from PRWeek. I'm John Harrington, the editor of PRWeek UK. I'm joined today by Farzana Baduel, founder and CEO of Curzon PR, and Shayoni Lynn, CEO and founder of Lynn. Welcome to you both.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Farzana and Shayoni are here today to discuss the implications of the terrible scenes we've witnessed in parts of the UK over recent days. Far-right riots and disorder have dominated the news agenda here. Very sadly, they've left many people, particularly from Asian and other minority ethnic backgrounds, frightened, concerned, and more. We're recording this on Thursday morning. Thankfully, reports of widespread disorder on Wednesday evening largely didn't materialise, although it's still tense and it's still unclear what happens next. Coincidentally, Farzana and Shayoni are two of the three founders of the new Asian Communications Network. The other is Vita Patel of the agency Comms Rebel, who's also President-elect of CIPR for 2024. So, as I say, thank you both for joining us today. I thought we should probably start by talking about the Asian Communications Network, actually. What's the background to the group and why are you launching it now? I appreciate the timings aren't at all related to, events of recent days.
Well, I guess we're three friends and we are so lucky to have found each other, and we have so many shared experiences, being from the South Asian community, working in public relations. Shayoni and myself and Vita, we also run our own sort of businesses. And we were just talking for so long about how much support we give each other and how we come across other people in the industry who often talk about how lonely they feel in the industry. And when we look every year at the depressing diversity statistics of the industry, we all felt actually we're so lucky to have found each other. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we can build a sense of community amongst not only South Asians, but across all of Asia, because they often feel even more underrepresented, the East Asians, because of the sort of the numbers involved in the industry. So we want it to be inclusive for the British Asian community. But also what's been wonderful since we've launched it is we've had the most incredible allies from outside of the British Asian community who want to get involved, who want to support. So it's a very inclusive network that we've launched and very much inspired by our friendship.
That's really great. And could you give us some examples of the kind of things you'll be doing with the network?
I think we've got some exciting plans. I think, the world is literally our oyster. We're starting with a small dinner on the 21st of August, and we've had incredible interest from people to join us for that dinner. So if you are interested in coming to that dinner, I'm sure we can share information, but you can find us also on asiancommsnetwork.com. We also have plans of a launch event in September, details soon to come. And we shall be hosting, we hope, an annual event. We hope to launch a podcast in the new year. And we have other exciting ideas, but I think the dinner is a real opportunity for us to hear from the community, understand what they need from a platform like this, try and then create and curate a program that is meaningful, because I think for the three of us, what's really important is authenticity. We want this to be a space that not just connects, but creates opportunities for the wider Asian community in communications. So we're here to listen. We're here to understand where people see barriers and how we can best help them in moving forward.
Great. Well, good luck with all of that. So I want to move on, obviously, to the events of recent days and speaking to people I know, particularly from Asian communities. It's been a difficult time. How have you both found the last week and what have you been saying to staff, colleagues, other friends in the industry?
God, I found it quite emotionally draining. It gave me almost sort of PTSD because having been born and brought up in the UK, I remember having, as a child, some of my earliest memories were racism. And people often think, and people often, sort of ask these questions of, what's your earliest memory, expecting something nice, warm and fluffy, like, my mother hugging me or something like that. And actually, unfortunately, my earliest memories are being chased up. I think I was in a park and there were these sort of racist thugs with pit bull terriers. And I was like a very young child. And my earliest memory was jumping up the climbing frame so that the dogs won't get me. And they were shouting out the P word. And I mean, even when I still talk about it, I sort of get emotional. But that's my earliest memory of being an ethnic minority in this country. And when I saw everything in the news, it just brought those memories back. So it's been very emotional.
My God, I'm sure. I'm so sorry to hear that. And Shayoni, is there anything you'd like to add?
I mean, of course, I am not born in Britain, so I don't have those lived experiences which I hear about and shake me. I have lived in the UK for over 15 years, and I've been quite fortunate to not have received overt racism very much in that time. But of course, I know it's there, it's present, and I see it in and around me. And often it's quite passive aggressive and may not be overt. For me personally, I've been quite anxious. I've been balancing personal and professional outlook. In that, personally, of course, all of us have felt really, well, I think terrified, really. I think it is terror in many forms, and we have felt terrified. Our community, not just in ACN, but just wider community, we've had messages constantly talking about this. We've had messages circulating asking us to stay at home, to lock our doors, to travel in groups, things that seem absolutely abhorrent in 2024. Yet, I think we were reflecting when we, Farzana, that when we see some of the conversations outside of ethnic and minority communities, it's not obviously as pervasive and present, and conversations of being on holiday and drinking and having fun seems at such a contrast to what we have experienced, I think, as a community in this week across the UK. And that's not a dig at anybody. I think it's just a reflection on the contrast between how the ethnic minority communities have communicated with each other, whether that's through closed groups or on social platforms, versus how perhaps non-ethnic minorities have felt during this time. But we've also had allies. We've had people who've checked in on us. We've had people who've it's been really reassuring. And of course, yesterday I think was that tipping point where Britain stood up and said, and I say this in quotation marks, enough is enough, because that is actually a racist trope. But enough is enough is basically what Britain said yesterday. They stood up and said, we will not have any more of this. So that's been my personal reflections. I was on the train, like obviously I live in Wales. Wales has not been hit by these protests, again in quotation marks, as England has. But even then, when I was traveling on Monday within Wales to the Eisteddfod, going on the train, I felt really anxious. And I'm traveling next week to Europe and I have to go into Bristol and I feel really anxious. So these are lived experiences that you can't deny. On the other hand, on the professional front, at Lynn, we run the misinformation cell. So we've been monitoring the situation actively since it sort of took over. And I've been partially doing a deep dive into the origin of these conspiracy theories, the disinformation narratives that has then led to the real world spillovers as we've seen them. And we've also been consulting with a lot of organizations, public sector organizations, helping them manage the crisis as it happens in real time. So it's been sort of that balancing act of my own personal lived experiences as sort of the communities that the far right would like to eject from the UK versus my professional lens of trying to understand what is happening, why it's happening, what we can learn from it, and how we can ensure we are not in this position again.
Yeah, well, thank you both for sharing your experiences. I think it's difficult, isn't it? In this industry, it's very hard to switch off from the big stories, isn't it? Regardless of what the stories are and what's happening in politics and society. So I expect in our industry it must be more difficult than many when it comes to coping with these sorts of situations.
Journalists and PRs, we're at the forefront of breaking news, and news has a tendency to focus on the negative, and it's not the media's fault. It's intrinsically human for us to sort of focus on threats and risks and so forth. So it has a sort of disproportionate space in our mind, which then it has obviously an impact on mental health. What's been really interesting during this time and what's been really heartwarming is people who are from the white majority have been very vocal about condemning the violence and the attacks on Muslims and ethnic minorities. And that feels so good as a minority to hear those voices. I mean, both Shayoni and I had both married white men. So we really embody sort of multiculturalism. And I had to sort of sit my 16-year-old daughter down, who has mixed heritage. And I've so far buffered her from this world of this ugly underbelly of racism because, so she hasn't experienced what I experienced growing up in the UK. But this was the first time I had to sit her down and explain to her what was happening because it all came on her TikTok. And she just didn't understand the logic of people hating people for something as illogical as this color of skin or the sort of melanin in our skin. And she was absolutely baffled that people would feel so strongly and harbor this sort of hatred. And what was quite interesting was the dinner party conversations of, oh yeah, it's terrible what they're doing, but they've got a point. We really need to sort this out, and just that sort of segue. And I just thought, God, the lack of empathy, instead of just actually, completely outright condemning it, and just that not even giving it a split second before they segue into, well, actually, this is why the country needs to take action on immigration. And that just felt even more belittled and sort of diminished, because whatever your views are on immigration, that doesn't mean that justifies what we've seen on the streets. And can I also say, I've had calls from my clients in the US who have said, what the hell is happening in the UK? And from a reputation perspective, my God, this country has taken a battering, because we are so fortunate that we have the world's strongest media houses, that have a global reach. We have the Financial Times, The Economist, The Guardian, and so forth. And we have these media houses, which is wonderful for our nation, but it also amplifies the good that we do as a country, and it also amplifies the ugly aspects. And there are people around the world who are tuning in thinking, do I really want to have my summer and Christmas holidays in the UK? Do I want to spend my money coming here for tourism? Do I want to invest in this country? Do I want to trade with this country? And a little bit like we saw at the aftermath of Brexit, where there was a narrative that, it was, which I don't agree with, that it was racist that voted for Brexit. But that was a narrative that played out that then has an impact upon our tourism, our trade and investment, and it diminishes us on the world stage. So I think the danger has not only been done in terms of social cohesion, but to brand Britain. And that, I think, is problematic and long term.
Just to add to Farzana's reflections on those dinner party conversations, I'm sure we'll come back to it. I suppose part of the disinformation campaign, and we've been tracking it, has been to normalize the far right. So there have been very specific hashtags that have been used to generate sympathy with those people with those extreme views. So we're starting to see how a lot of the tactics are now bleeding so much more into the mainstream at such pace to start and normalize a culture that is of benefit to certain political actors within this state and outside the state.
Yeah, it would be good to talk about the disinformation, actually. Obviously, it's been rampant since the tragic attack in Southport. The sort of fake reports that the attacker was a refugee who came over on a small boat, that he's Muslim. I don't think there's any evidence. Obviously, there's a lot that's going to come out on that. And there were initially those reporting restrictions due to the fact that he was 17. Anyway, I mean, what have the riots sort of told you about the state of disinformation on social media?
It's been really interesting tracking it. So I suppose my reflection in a conversation yesterday was a lot of the tactics used to create this political environment we've seen before. It's been done for several years. We've seen it done through the disinformation as Trump got into power and then during his presidency. We've seen it in the pandemic. But I feel like it's almost as if disinformation actors have been finessing their tools through those years to see really what sticks and what doesn't. What is it that they can really deploy? And this seems to me to be that sort of moment in time where they've launched their campaign to the population. They've sort of perfected a mix that works, that is able to galvanize people into the real world spillover that they so desire. And what do I mean by that? So if you actually go back, at Lynn, we'll be soon publishing a deep dive into this report that will make a lot more sense in terms of the chronology. But if you actually go to the start of this disinformation campaign that we've seen for the riots, it started with, like most disinformation campaigns, it started small. It started with one post on Facebook, which alleged there was a migrant who was the perpetrator of these killings. And it was a small account. We don't know whether that was a real account or a false account. That spilled into Twitter with, again, one small post, although this time with someone with influence. They had 40,000 followers who identified the individual with the false name that we have seen, the Muslim name that has been circulating. That was then retweeted by a purveyor of false information, should we say. And before you know it, that was latched on by the false media house, in quotation marks, Channel 3 Now, which then blew up. So that is the disinformation playbook. Start small, build, typically with bots, which we've seen in this case as well. Then that sort of seeps into, I suppose, what misinformation researchers will call susceptible hosts or receptive hosts, people who have susceptibility to share false information, whether they believe it or not. And that's how it proliferates then into the mainstream. So that's of the disinformation narrative playbook. You start small, you build with bots, you latch on to susceptible hosts, and then it explodes. So that's how we've seen this disinformation campaign really take over. But I think when I go back to what is driving this campaign, we've all seen the posts about civil war, right? We've all seen the very violent displays on the streets by far right extremists, chucking bricks, doing whatever. Why do you think that has been? It all ladders up to a global conspiracy theory, which is the Great Replacement Theory. And the Great Replacement Theory falsely states that the white population in the global north are being replaced by minority communities from the global south. And they are being aided by feminists and liberals. And the only way to save the white population is via a genocidal civil war. And so when you see a lot of this symbolic displays of violence, that is a cornerstone of the Great Replacement Theory. It's almost like they're rehearsing their fantasy of this civil war that they see coming. Now, this is obviously false. We know that. But this is a very, very key long-term conspiracy theory that we've seen across the globe. And this is what is sort of driving a lot of the far right agenda. So fundamentally, this isn't going away. The Prime Minister has shown real determination and ability to bring this under control. What minority communities have needed has been to see displays of police protection, of arrests. That has been reassuring, that brings calm. So they've all done things to, I suppose, stem the current tide and bring things, we hope, into order going forwards. But a lot of the disinformation that has been orchestrated by, whether you call them disinfluencers like Mark Owen Jones calls, or belief entrepreneurs like Nigel Farage, like Richard Tice, of course, Tommy Robinson, they are playing a political game. And it is to convert, as the analysis shows, as many reform or right-wing Tories to a strategy of tension and active resistance to government. And so fundamentally, the agenda in this particular period is to destabilize the Labour government. So what we're seeing on the surface, driven by conspiracy theory, the Great Replacement Theory, is backed by a very, very clear political agenda that is of benefit to certain political parties and certain state actors.
It's really worrying. And John, I think what's really fascinating is Shayoni's given a really forensic and robust account of all of the tactics that are being used and honed. And by virtue of social media, it brings so many benefits, but it also brings an opportunity for sort of disinformation to really come together and amplify. But I think there's other areas that we also need to kind of really be cognizant of. And one is culture and psychology. And so it's really about, how could this flourish within our culture? What are the drivers that have enabled this to go from our social media platforms to our streets, that have really allowed people to think it's okay to, I think I saw a video of somebody running after a person of colour with a chainsaw, firebombing mosques. I mean, the most horrific things I didn't think I would ever see in my daughter's life. But I think what's been really interesting is actually, what about the accountability of certain media houses? I mean, over the last few months, I've been, it's my job as a PR, I read across the spectrum. I read all of, different media houses in the UK and abroad. And over the months, I have been seeing such anti-Muslim rhetoric in certain media houses. And actually, a couple of weeks ago, I even said to my husband, I said, I'm really worried about this media house, because I can even see the shifts in people around me making comments to me anti-Muslim, not sort of realizing that I am, from a Muslim background. And I could really feel this sort of crescendo of these media houses. And I think that there's a culpability there of how they are feeding in to the national psyche, this sort of narrative. And we understand, because people say, well, actually, if somebody of color committed a crime, they should be, sort of accounted about. And I absolutely agree. But what you're seeing is a sense of disproportionality and space given to crimes that have been committed by people of color. And it's that classic, if something happens, if it's somebody of an ethnic minority, they don't really talk about the fact that there's a mental illness there. But if it's a crime done by a white person, then it's like, a lot more empathy is given in particular media houses to their sort of mental health issues. It's that sense of disproportion that I find is really worrying. And then you couple that with some of the rhetoric by some of the politicians we had in the previous government, and how they use dehumanizing language, whether you believe in controlled immigration or not, or whatever your beliefs are. Migrants are human beings. Let's not dehumanize them. You can want to have controlled migration, and you want to you can also want to have reduced migration numbers without resorting to dehumanizing rhetoric. It's possible to have empathy and see them as human beings, and at the same time, campaign for reduced migration. You don't have to take that route. And our politicians have enabled that sort of language. And I think there's certain politicians in our country, and there are certain media houses that have to take accountability for what has happened on the streets. We have to understand that there are drivers to our culture, and the culture has enabled these actions to spill onto our streets. And a couple of those drivers are politicians and media houses. And then we've also had, of all, if we didn't have more problems with our politicians and our media houses, we also have now Elon Musk. And so there are people thinking, here's a man, he's made so much money, he's such a genius, he does these incredible things with rockets and cars, so therefore he must be, listened to across all aspects, and it's that sort of fallacy. If somebody's successful in one area, that, you have to listen to them in all other areas, and sort of sending tweets out, or X's or whatever he calls it. Absolutely horrific how he's been wading in. So I think there's, leadership and media houses need to really have a strong, hard look in the mirror and take accountability, because in my opinion, they are also to blame for what has happened.
Could I add on Elon Musk? He's very much part of the problem. And there is now evidence to question, I suppose, whether he's radicalizing himself. There is discussion within academic circles which says that he bought X, or Twitter, as I'll forever call it, Twitter, not as a social media platform, but to spread his ideology, which is becoming more and more far right, anti-progressive, anti-woke agenda. And the report that we release tomorrow will actually demonstrate how he has been actively promoting disinformation campaigns and the Great Replacement Theory. So we can see that he's not just a leader in that sense, who is getting involved on a personal, whatever we were thinking, I'd say about 6 or 10 months ago, but he's actively part of this network, the modern far right movement. He's absolutely part of that. Whether he accepts it or not, his actions demonstrate that he is supporting them, he's proliferating their messages, and he's creating further division. And he's doing so strategically because he is the most followed person on Twitter. One mention from him will make a post explode. And there's significant examples since 2023 where he has been using the code for the Great Replacement Theory, which is civil war, several times, where he brought Stephen Yaxley Lennon, or Tommy Robinson, back onto X, who was banned for several years from all social media. He not only welcomed him back, but he's boosted his content. He's replied to his content. He shared his content. So he's actively promoting the disinformation and conspiracy theories that is furthering division in our communities.
Do you think it's time the industry dumps Twitter?
It's a really interesting question, and there's a lot of discussion about the Online Safety Act and, does it go far enough? And, of course, the government can forget the industry. Of course, the government, I don't think the industry will dump Twitter because, clients will want to be present on these platforms in some shape or form. And until there is enforcement, I don't think the industry will necessarily conclusively dump Twitter. But the government does have a choice. It could ban, not just the UK government, but also Europe, could ban Twitter. As we've had examples of TikTok being banned. But I think an even more effective solution is fining them, very similar to the GDPR Act. So if you are found to be allowing some certain levels of disinformation, because I suppose you can't manage all of it, to proliferate and there's real world spillover, you get fined X% of revenue. Now, that is a real financial threat that could actually motivate tech companies to create better infrastructure to contain some of this.
Yes, no, it's a good point. I mean, looking at, you mentioned some of the responses to the riots from Keir Starmer, from the government and so on, and you're sort of saying that some of those have been quite good at putting the other side and sort of trying to encourage calm and suggest there's action. Are there any other sorts of individuals, institutions that you think have handled the situation particularly well or particularly poorly during this crisis?
I'd just say that we've been on the back foot throughout this. So if you look at the sort of trajectory of content, you see the massive spike on 29th of July, which is fueled by disinformation. And it is an incredible spike. And it's about 24 hours later that organizations start debunking and putting out true information to correct the false information. It's too late by then because it has exploded. The content is circulating. So I think we've been on a back foot from the very beginning. There was no chance for us to win this war, in quotations. But I think organizations obviously acknowledge it from Lynn's perspective and my personal perspective. Some great responses by MPs who are really connecting with their communities to try and set the facts right and be very clear about where there is misinformation, where there isn't. I know that police forces are working really hard to try and manage the situation. If I had to put my finger on, I think, who's done a really good job, I would say one is obviously a group of academics and journalists who've been fact checking, debunking, putting out lots of information through the week, which has been incredible, and some really good deep dives, investigative analysis, such as Marco and Jones, who's done some really good analysis on hashtags and giving you insights into where they originate and who's fueling it and who's driving it. That's been really helpful, I think. But also, I think Anonymous, the hacking collective, has been, I've personally found it to be very reassuring to have someone like Anonymous on our side who is constantly identifying these rioters and tagging them to the right police force. So that for me, I think, has been an incredible display of technology for good, where a hacking collective has come forward and say, we say no to fascists, and really, really gone to town to really prove that you should not mess with them.
I mean, what personally touched me the most is actually a friend of mine who's deeply Christian, who reached out and talked about the Good Samaritan parable and how he felt that if there are other groups being attacked that isn't within his ethnic group or religious group, he feels it's his religious duty to really reach out to all the people and offer support, which I thought actually touched me the most, because when somebody from outside of the group that isn't being attacked speaks up, that just really feels reassuring. When I look at sort of others, I mean, I would say actually it was quite interesting. I was following the MP for Walthamstow. She's a Labour MP called Stella Creasy, and and I was really intrigued by her, her communications, because of course, Walthamstow, everybody was expecting a far right protest yesterday, and just, she tweeted 31 minutes ago, solidarity isn't just for crisis moments, but every day. Walthamstow, one of our local mosques, has an open day this weekend. Everyone is welcome. And I just think it's been really lovely to see actually the mosques in the UK, instead of sort of like just, looking inwards out of fear, that they are working with, MPs such as Stella Creasy to actually, in this time, this is more than ever to come have a cup of tea with us, understand who we are. And I think, to keep those doors open. And I think, when you have these dark times in our nation, such as, we've had in the last 2 weeks, I believe in the British people. And I think that we've been put on a back foot. They've taken advantage of the fact that we've all been slightly, we've been in shock. But I think that, as you can see from the crowds that turned up in Walthamstow, the anti-racists, we are mobilizing, and, that tiny minority of hate, we'll put them back in their boxes, and deservedly so. There's always been, I think there's been other people that have inspired me. Our co-founder, Advita Patel, has been putting out on LinkedIn, she's obviously an internal comm specialist, advice, for people to check in with their ethnic minority and Muslim colleagues, and how to do so with sort of empathy. And so really giving really good practical advice on LinkedIn. So I think there's been some fantastic internal comms people in our industry who've been just sharing for free on LinkedIn, for allies, on how they can approach people who, and how they're feeling. People such as like Satnam Sanghera, the writer, he's been doing, there's been a lot of, I think, people, but I love that people obviously from the ethnic minority community and the Muslim community are doing it, but I really love the allies who are not of the same religion, who are white, people like my husband, Shayoni's husband, and so many others who have been stepping up. And when I saw those pictures of the crowds in Walthamstow, and so many of them were white, and I thought, that's why I'm proud to be British. And that's why I think Britain is great, because we are not hate Britain, we are Great Britain. And this minority, they're a blip, and and we will mobilise against them.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing I've noticed is, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, a sort of lack of responses from companies and from brands. And I was thinking back to 2020, post George Floyd murder, and the sort of the black squares and all of that sort of stuff, where a lot of brands and companies were very, very vocal in their support for the black community. Have you sort of thought about this element, that there does seem to be far less overt support from brands and from corporations, and why do you think that might be?
And one of the reasons, I just spent a month in the US, and I was with some African American friends of mine, and we were having a similar conversation, and they were saying, well, they have a very long history of oppression, and they have had a very long history to mobilize and organize against it. And whereas I think perhaps Islamophobia has sort of taken root in the UK, it's been relatively recent. And and the sort of the suffering of the African Americans have been across generations. And whereas I think the Muslims in the UK have sort of been in a matter of decades, really. And I think that they haven't had the time to really mobilize and react and sort of organize and articulate their position. And I think that perhaps is one of the reasons that African Americans simply have a longer history of discrimination and hate towards their communities, and that's given them time to organise. And I think that perhaps the Muslim communities in the UK, we haven't had that same sort of longevity in terms of having the time and the resources, which I hope will change and will shift. The only person that's really been championing in our sort of media has been Saida Varsi, who's in the House of Lords, and she's been talking about it for years and only given a bit of sort of airtime occasionally when a report comes out, and she's in the media studios. But really, it hasn't really taken traction. And I think it's that sort of Islamophobia is the thing that, allows, is almost acceptable. I mean, I'm of a Muslim background. I'm not particularly religious, but people say the most Islamophobic things to me. And I'm thinking, oh my God. And I'm so shocked. I sometimes don't say anything. But actually, it's kind of made me realize that I have to say something and I have to counter and not internalize the phobia. I have friends of mine who wear the headscarf, and it's so sad that when a tube comes, I was taking a tube with them a couple of months ago, and they consciously weren't being sort of near the yellow line. And I sort of had a conversation about them, and they said, oh, no, we all know as women who wear headscarves, you don't go near the yellow line until the train has arrived, because we're scared of being pushed into the tracks. And and I know so many friends of mine who do wear the headscarf because they're visibly Muslim. Someone like me, people don't know what I am unless they know my name. And when I'm walking down the street, I could be Hindu, Sikh, but women who wear headscarves, they are so visible, and the horrors that they go through being spat at, having their head, and they've been talking about it for a long time, a very long time, but only those in the community who know them as friends know what's been happening to them. And I just hope that perhaps the Islamophobia will be taken a little bit more seriously.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder as well if, we've spoken in the last couple of years about the sort of corporate retreat from speaking out generally, whether that's about social issues, prejudice, whatever it might be. You look at things like the declining number of brands doing pride campaigns, for example. I wonder if there's an element of that sort of general trend here, or maybe I'm overthinking it.
No, I think you're right. John, because I think, in the groups that I've been on, I know that brands, well, the groups, the communications groups, the close groups that I'm on, I know that in-house directors of comms have been seeking advice on whether or not to have a position, and I know that some brands are feeling quite conflicted. But I suppose if I reflect, like, what do you say as a brand? Do you just come out and say I'm anti-fascist? Like, you'd hope you are. I mean, it seems to me a quite futile statement to put out, and I think it's from a lived experience of being like with Farzana and Advita, sort of receiving end of this. I really don't care what brand says, frankly, at this point. I'd rather want the government and the police to take charge and bring this situation under control, and a better discourse on Islamophobia and migrants and disinformation. I'd much rather appreciate a conversation on that than a brand randomly saying we hate fascists. Like, bloody hope you do. I feel it would be quite shallow,
Yeah,
personally, if a brand did come out and say something like that.
I think what's quite interesting is I think that back in the day, people would just put a post up, during Pride, and and just change their logo with Pride colours, or BLM put a post out saying we support. And I think quite rightly, the activists started saying, don't jump on the bandwagon, don't sort of diversity wash, don't sort of pride wash. If you're just using it for sort of brand engagement, what you should do is marry intentionality with action, and most importantly, resource. And instead of sort of virtue signaling, look inwards to see what can you do that's tangible. Because we've all seen organizations that sort of like supported BLM on their Instagram, and then you go to their leadership page and there's not a single Black person there. And that sort of that gap between what you say and what you do is far more scrutinized today than it was before. And it's making companies and organizations think twice. And I'm hoping they're thinking twice because they are thinking about how to win people's hearts and minds through action as opposed to empty rhetoric. And so I'm hoping that they're more considered about it. And I also think that you shouldn't really jump on the bandwagon unless it's kind of relevant to you, really. So, for instance, I'm a trustee for the British Asian Trust, which is King Charles's charity for South Asia. And communities is very relevant to the British Asian Trust. And they have been communicating on their Instagram and their Twitter, sending emails to all our stakeholders because it's relevant to them. Whereas if you just have an organization that it isn't relevant to, it isn't espousing their values and the work that they do and, and so forth, then you have to really think, why are they jumping on the bandwagon, unless they care about it enough to actually think about it much deeper than a news cycle and a social media post, and actually do something tangible to help. Which, there are a lot of community groups and faith groups that are doing it across the spectrum.
yeah. No, it makes sense. Obviously, it's been a fascinating conversation. I don't know if that's the right word, but a very useful one. And I think I've learned a lot, and I'm sure a lot of people listening to this have as well. But I wanted to kind of end on a question, almost coming back to what we were talking about near the start. Really, it's just advice. What advice would you give to industry leaders who are unsure about how to react in these difficult times regarding their own staff, regarding their own internal communications, and so on?
I would rather selfishly say these networks that exist, the Black Communications Network, they do fantastic work. People like us, incredible organization, and obviously our new emerging Asian Communications Network. There's so many white allies that want to help, but they feel, well, maybe I shouldn't because I'm not of that ethnicity. And what I would say is that we should all be inclusive and support each other. And and we have people coming to our dinner who are white, who say that we really want to support, and almost tentatively asking, but our doors are wide open to the industry. And although we call it the Asian Communication Network, it is open to people of all colours who care about about really supporting the minority and bringing balance back to the industry to ensure that our industry reflects the public. It's good for our industry, it's good business, it's good for the country, it's good for humanity. So I would say have a look at the organisations that are already running, that are doing amazing work, and do not feel that, oh, I have to be Black in order to support the Black Communications Network, or I have to be Asian to support the ACN, or people like us. It is open to all of us to support. And I think that simple phrase, one love. And I think the industry that I've come across in the PR industry has been so warm. I absolutely love our industry. And I think that we just should work together and collaborate and connect and continue our community work.
I couldn't say it better than Farzana did. I'd just say check in on your colleagues. It might seem, as Farzana said, you might be hesitant because you're white and you might feel it's not your place to ask those questions, but it is. We appreciate it. We appreciate being reassured. We appreciate knowing that we have allies. So check in on your colleagues. And it's not just minority communities. Someone in my team who's a white male, his little one was meant to go to a dance class yesterday, but that was shut down because of the imminent protests, which didn't materialize. So terrorized his child and their friends. So it's affecting the white majority alongside the ethnic minority. So check in, talk about it, discuss. And I'd say from a more professional perspective, the disinformation we've seen is a prototype that will materialize now again and again across different cross sections of society. Right now, we've been looking at it through the lens of race and sort of policing and justice. But I have no doubt that this will spill into areas like health, into areas like climate change, because those are areas that are very susceptible to bad faith actors weaponizing it to further their own agenda. So you observe this period as, I suppose, as a baseline of what is yet to come, which feels quite sad saying it, and I hope I'm wrong, but I do feel we're going to see this same playbook deployed again and again and again, because there's a fundamental agenda that is driving this, and there are people, typically white men of a certain age, who come from deprived or vulnerable sections of our society, who will believe these conspiracy theories and will act out in a way that they feel they're supporting their community. So I think that understanding and knowledge that this perhaps isn't going to go away, and what can we learn from it, and how can we use some of these insights to integrate into planning going forwards, would be my professional advice. And as I say, we are about to launch a report which sort of deep dives into what we've seen with some key takeaways, and hopefully, and that'll be free to download. So hopefully that's of interest. And two plugs, John, if I may. One is asiancompsnetwork.com. If you would like to join ACN, please come have a look at our website. Find Farzana, Advita, myself on socials, and drop us a message. And if you would then like anything on the disinformation side, lynn.global, we will be having that report out soon.
Okay, well, it's really, really good advice and really, really salient insights. Thank you so much, Farzana and Shayoni, for taking the time to join me today at short notice and discuss such a, frankly, difficult topic, but such an important one. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
So just to say, thanks to everyone for listening, take care of yourselves, and until next time, goodbye.